Hello and welcome to Let's Talk About It. I'm Gerry Henwood, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing two women who are the CEO and the executive director of a very important organization. It is the Montgomery County Mission Kids Child Advocacy Center. And before today, I had not heard of it, and I'm sure many of you have not heard of it, but today we're going to find out much more about the important work that this organization is doing under the leadership of Abbie Newman. Welcome, Abbie.
Welcome, thank you.
And Leslie Slingsby.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you too. So could you please tell us, Leslie, first of all, what is the organization all about?
Yeah, Mission Kids is the nationally accredited child advocacy center for Montgomery County. And so its real goal is to achieve healing and justice for child abuse victims in our community. And so we've recently kind of broadened our scope a little bit more. And so we're trying to make sure every child who we have a suspicion or has an allegation of child abuse gets responded with best practices in mind.
And in terms of the staffing of this organization, how many are on staff?
Yeah, so we have 16 staff members, and it also takes a lot of volunteers to run the Child Advocacy Center. But we have 16 staff members, and we have lots of multidisciplinary team members who also help us respond to child abuse allegations.
I see. And Abbie, could you tell us a little bit about the activities of this organization?
Sure. Well, there are several layers to it. So the first and most important one are the services that we provide in Montgomery County to suspected victims of child abuse, both sexual abuse and serious physical abuse children. We serve approximately 600 children per year with those direct services just in Montgomery County. We've now also seen that the services that we provide are so sought after and so necessary that we have moved beyond Montgomery County to help develop responses to child abuse at both the state, national, and international levels.
And what are the ages of the children whom you service, Leslie?
Yeah, so it can be anywhere from when they start talking, so we would say verbal, which is around that 2-3 mark, all the way through 18.
My goodness. Now, this is a very sensitive issue, and prior to the show beginning, we were talking about the distinction between sexual abuse and trafficking. Could you talk a little bit about that, Abbie?
Sure. Well, any child who's a victim of child sexual abuse, by definition, is a very vulnerable child. When you try to explain a child who's been a victim of sex trafficking, the only way I can explain it is that vulnerability and that damage on steroids. So we often think of victims of sex trafficking as being foreign nationals, not in the United States, and certainly not in Montgomery County. And what we being the bigger picture we, have come to understand in the last several years, that in actuality, human trafficking is really in every community. It is in Montgomery County. We have identified probably close to 24 cases and victims of human trafficking at Mission Kids. And so it is a much larger problem than anybody actually realized before.
Is this a problem that only affects a certain socioeconomic group, or is it across the socioeconomic spectrum, Leslie?
So with child sexual abuse in general, or child abuse, it touches everyone's lives, and no matter what socioeconomic, racial background, religious background, absolutely. We see that people are vulnerable to child sexual abuse in their own families and communities. With sex trafficking, that demographic might be a little bit different, but it still hits all different types of people and families. I think Abbie's right, where we really thought that it was maybe undocumented community members, but it really isn't. I mean, we probably have had 2 undocumented out of that 24. So they're really Montgomery County citizens.
Yes. Now, how do the people who notice or who somehow figure out who is a sexually abused child, how do they target those children for human trafficking?
So we know so little about the real demographics of human trafficking, and we're actually working very hard to try to uncover exactly what they are in Pennsylvania. We believe that 50% of human trafficking victims enter what they call the life as minors, so under the age of 18. We know that many of these victims have been prior victims of child sexual abuse. So that makes the child vulnerable. Now, what we know about child sexual abuse is that only 1 in 10 of those children actually report that they have been sexually abused. So the first issue is attacking child sexual abuse and really continuing to understand that and talk about it. We also know that victims of human trafficking, 70% of those minors that are involved with it have been through the foster care system. So children who are already vulnerable and in foster care are even more vulnerable to being victims. The identification, people need to be aware, they need to look, they need to think about it. Unusual tattoos that might brand a child. It might say something like daddy's girl, or it may have a barcode for ownership by the trafficker or the pimp. A child who is more withdrawn. If you are in a doctor's office and a child is brought in for medical care, if they're with somebody who's answering all of the questions for that child, or a hospital ER for an adult or a child, if somebody is answering those questions. For adults, they may not have their identification papers and they're not allowed to speak. They are being held and manipulated by the traffickers so that they can be sold and they are controlled.
I see. Now, the funding for your program, where does that come from?
It's a combination of support that funds Mission Kids. So we do get county funding from our Office of Children and Youth and our District Attorney's Office. We also get grants through the state government, through the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. And then we have, luckily, generous partners in the community. So we have private foundations and private donors who also support our organization. We also have an annual event each year that raises about a quarter of our operating budget every year so that we can make sure that we keep operating and growing so that we can serve the actual need in the community.
Now, both this annual event and the location of your organization, could you tell us a little bit more about where the organization is located in case people might want to look into it with the idea of contributing, but also about the annual event as well?
Okay.
Abbie?
Okay.
Or whoever?
Sure. So we are physically located in East Norriton. Unfortunately, people just can't drop by because of the sensitivity of what happens on site. At Mission Kids, when the children come in, what we're set up to do is to keep potential child sexual abuse victims from being re-traumatized through the system. So in communities that don't have a child advocacy center, if a child reports sexual abuse, they will have to go through, say, from the teacher to the principal and be interviewed by the principal. The principal may call Children and Youth Services, who will then interview that child. Then the police will get involved, and a large policeman may come and do what feels to the child like an interrogation. And then the district attorney's office will interview that child. Well, each time that child is re-interviewed, they're being re-traumatized. They're being made to relive what happened to them, and they're being made to feel that they're not being believed. And since that's what their abusers probably told them all along, is that nobody's going to believe you, that's just being reinforced. With the Child Advocacy Center, what we've done is to change the system response in Montgomery County. So whenever Children and Youth Services or the police or Childline get a report of child abuse, Childline will report it to OCY and the police. They will then continue their investigation other than the interview of the child. They will set up an interview at Mission Kids, and we have specially trained forensic interviewers who will perform that interview. The team members, the police and the social worker, and maybe a child advocate, will watch that interview in real time, simultaneously in another room. So they get the benefit of watching the live interview. And there's nothing like watching a child interact with a forensic interviewer who's just doing rapport building and asking them about school, and the child's chatting, and then says, "Do you know why you're here today?" And the child goes from chatting, "No, I don't know why I'm here." That's really powerful. And so the team members get the benefit of this live interview. They talk to each other, and so they share information, and social workers and police look at cases totally differently. And so it's a better investigation for the child.
Now, you just mentioned the police.
Yes.
So they're one of your partners, obviously. Who are some of the other partners?
Yeah, so we have every police department in Montgomery as a partner of Mission Kids. We also have the district attorney's office. We also have the Office of Children and Youth. We also have the Montgomery County Advocacy Project, and so those are pro bono attorneys that would also represent a child. And then we have Mission Kids staff who serve as the family advocate and the forensic interviewer. And then we have mental health partners across Montgomery County as well as on site at Mission Kids. And then we are very lucky in our area that we have Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and that we have so many child abuse pediatricians who can see our children and help them kind of understand their body, ask really difficult questions about their body, and hear that their body is safe and normal.
Mm-hmm. Now, you recently received a $300,000 grant, and it's a 2-year grant. And could you tell us what is earmarked and how that money will be spent over the 2-year period?
So this grant is from the state of Pennsylvania through PCCD, the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. And it was given to one agency in the Commonwealth, and that was to Mission Kids, specifically to work with all of our partner organizations and then additional partners, specifically to look at how to respond to human trafficking victims, both minors and adults, to come up with policies and procedures that will work not only in Montgomery County, but that can be replicated across the state of Pennsylvania. We know that human trafficking victims don't often stay in one place. They may be transported across county lines, and so it's very important that the counties speak with each other, and states as well. We've had children recovered in other states that need to come back to Montgomery County who have been trafficked.
Right. Now, is there any research component to the grant? Usually when there is a grant, there is some kind of a follow-up that the people who have given you that money expect in return. What kind of either research or follow-up is planned as a result of the grant?
Yeah, well, Montgomery County is a great area to really look at sex trafficking as the 3rd largest county in Pennsylvania, as well as knowing that we are a hub of lots of major highways. We do have to respond to the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency with how many adult as well as child sex trafficking victims that any of our partners came in contact with. We're also going to be doing, creating policies, procedures. We're actually going to be testing those out in Montgomery County, seeing what works, what doesn't work, as well as putting together a training curriculum and then doing research on the training curriculum. Are we able to train our partners to better respond to sex trafficking, and what does that look like? So we'll actually be able to provide the state with a final package of documents that they can use to replicate across Pennsylvania.
I see. It was about 25 years ago when I was still working in the Lower Merion School District that I participated as a teacher in a specially trained group to identify suicide ideation, alcohol, and drug abuse.
Sure.
And I can see this topic now being part of that kind of training for teachers. Are you aware of any plans to make school districts your partners?
Yeah, well, school districts are our partners. Certainly, they are our largest referral source of child abuse, period. And so we need them to start looking also at sex trafficking as well, because they've been doing a great job identifying child abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse, and making those reports. And you're right, programs like the Student Assistance Program is a perfect opportunity for us to educate them about signs and symptoms, what to look for, not only with physical abuse and sexual abuse, but also sex trafficking. So if they see a student in their classroom who all of a sudden has a cell phone, all of a sudden has nice gifts, and they're not sure exactly where those gifts would have come from, these are things that they should start looking into further and reporting, just like they would child sexual abuse and child physical abuse.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the same way that you just made very concrete a school situation, could you, I know that one of the victims of trafficking is now involved with your organization. And if I understood the article correctly, that may have helped you get the grant as well.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about how this person came to you and how they are now participating in the organization?
Sure. We actually, I think, were referred to her through the Salvation Army. We are partnering with them. They do very good work as well in the area of human trafficking. And we were looking specifically to have a survivor on our team because we can talk and we can understand the knowledge and the statistics and the research that's been done. And I can identify for you more areas of research that need to be done. But we haven't lived it. And this is such a new area that there's not a large body of evidence and research from the survivors themselves who have lived it. So what she's doing on our team, she's really a wonderful woman, and she's helpful. She comes to all the meetings, and she will participate, and as we're coming up with services, say, that are needed for survivors, education, training, getting help with expunging a criminal record that they might have for prostitution, she can talk about her own experiences and talk about what's practical and what's not. I can't share with you her own story because that's not ours to share, but that's the way that she's working with us, and she's of a tremendous benefit and of a help, and we thank her, and we're very grateful for her presence.
Right. Now, we see on the TV and we read in the newspapers about sexual abuse, and we know that it is traumatizing. Now, in terms of the distinction between the sexual abuse and the trafficking, are there differences in the traumatic outcomes for these victims? And could you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, is a big difference. We know with child sexual abuse, there are some factors that would help kids still experience child sexual abuse and grow up to be happy, healthy, very productive citizens in our community. We know that a quarter of our population are sexual assault victims. And so when you're looking at a classroom or you're looking at a company, a quarter of those people already have survived child sexual assault as a child. And so the research we know regarding the traumatic effects certainly are significant with child sexual abuse. But with the proper services in place and with parents and caregiver support, we can actually do a really great job with resiliency. With that being said, with sex trafficking victims, it is a little more challenging because oftentimes they lack that support system. You heard them talk about being in foster care is really a high risk for that. Well, that means they really aren't with their biological family, and so might not have that lifelong connection with family members and friends and social supports that can kind of help them, support them through that. It's also really more challenging to get them into services and into therapy and things like that. So the traumatic effects are certainly significant with both populations, but we need to learn more about, we know a lot about child sexual abuse, and we need to learn more about how to help sex trafficking victims, minors and adults.
We also know, just to tag on to what Leslie just said, that for sex trafficking victims, often because of the way we as a society react, the victims have a criminal record. It's only at the end of 2018 that Pennsylvania adopted a safe harbor bill. And what that is a new law that says you cannot arrest a child for being a prostitute. Well, under the law, a child cannot consent to have sex. So if you're arresting a child as a prostitute, what you're actually arresting is a victim of child rape. So it's taken us this long to actually understand a child victim of trafficking is a victim and not a criminal. If a victim is recovered as an adult, there is no kind of protection for an adult victim either. These victims have a criminal record often because they've been arrested as prostitutes. The buyers who buy sex are also having an illegal activity by purchasing sex. If they are caught, the Johns or the buyers, usually they're misdemeanors. Often they are people that live in our community. Middle-class men are is the stereotype of the buyer. So they don't have a criminal record, so they're often just given a misdemeanor warning and they're let go. Well, the sellers of sex have already been arrested, so they're more subject now to higher charges, but they can't get away from the trafficker because they're being emotionally manipulated, mentally manipulated, often drug addicted, threatened. they don't have the education to get out. And then if they do manage to break away at that point, they can't get a job because they have a criminal record. So first they have to move away and get their criminal records expunged. We also partner with the CSE Institute at Villanova University, and they work specifically with victims of trafficking, and they do great work in terms of helping the victims expunge their records. But they can't work with every victim, and every victim doesn't know that they're there to find and to help. So again, the victims of sex trafficking, child sexual abuse is an awful, horrible thing to happen to a child. It is traumatizing, and if it's not treated correctly, it can be re-traumatizing throughout their life. We know that kids are resilient. We know with help, they often go on to healing and have wonderful lives ahead of them. Sex trafficking victims are these victims on steroids. I don't know any other way to put it, and we are still trying to figure out the best ways to help them move through and get out of where they've been. And any of those victims that come out and can help us, the survivors, we're very grateful to them, and they are really strong individuals, really strong.
Now, we only have a few moments left, but I'd like to know, maybe take a minute for each one of you, what has brought you, given your professional backgrounds, to the point that you wanted to become involved in this particular issue?
Yeah, so actually what drew me to this was, I certainly remember when I was younger, my father was a principal of a high school, and they suspected a child was being abused. And unfortunately, the law enforcement, as well as the Child Protective Services, felt like their hands were tied. And so they stayed there overnight because this child was so afraid to go home. They told the police, and the police understood that. And they said, well, he doesn't have to go home, and you don't have to leave school. So kind of saying like he could stay there and be safe. But I knew the system wasn't working for kids responding to child abuse allegations. And that absolutely drew me into this work in saying that we need to really change the system responding to child abuse allegations, and that's what Mission Kids has really done, kind of revolutionize kind of how we're dealing with children and making sure they have access to healing and justice.
And how about you, Abbie?
My background is that my first career was as a pediatric nurse, and then I went to law school and I was a litigator for a long time, 18 or 20 years. And I decided that I really wanted to get back closer to feeling I was working more directly with helping people, but kids in particular. And I knew I didn't want to go back to nursing. So I started looking at nonprofits and got some experience in the nonprofit world. And I was approached by Risa Vetri-Furman, who was in the DA's office at the time, who was coming up with the concept of a child advocacy center. And she said, I need somebody to really work on this project and be the executive director. Would you be interested? And I was like, oh yeah. This is perfect. What a great combination for me, working with, coming up with ways and concepts and developing a system in Montgomery County to respond to child victims of abuse. So,
well, I would like to thank both of you for coming today and sharing with me and our audience this story about not only sexual abuse, but human trafficking. It's been very illuminating for me, as I'm sure for the audience as well. Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Sure.